Jared Parker, and today I'm going to be talking about disaster planning using location analytics and QGIS for a town in rural Tennessee. And so for safety purposes, this information does not get used in an actual disaster. I'm going to be referring to this town as TownX throughout the video. And so my disaster that I chose for this town was a flood during the springtime while the kids were in school. And so the reason I did this is because I made a couple of assumptions as I started this project. One was that most of the time if it's going to rain a lot, it's going to rain in the springtime. And then I'm assuming that if it's in the springtime, the kids will be in school, and it could be a weekday, so that's what we're planning for. Worst case scenario, it's a flood during a school day, and they need to get the kids out. And so I'm assuming that churches and other government facilities will help get these kids get to safety and get them out of the schools that they're currently in that are next to the potential flood zones. And so that way they'll be able to get to safety. I am also assuming that the dam that feeds the river is going to break, which will cause excess flooding, which is why they need to get the kids out of this area. And they need them out of it quickly, whereas the flood may not happen instantaneously, but it will happen in the next few hours. So they need to get these kids quickly to a location where their parents can come pick them up and then go from there. They don't need to be in the schools as this water's coming in. They need to be able to be careful and get to safety. So one of the first things I did was I loaded all my information into QGIS, all my shape files, so I can begin to filter down and overlay layers so I can see where everything was. So the first thing I did is I inputted all my layers, my county layers, my city boundaries, so I could see everything. And so this is what it looks like at first, and it looks like a jumbled mess of stuff, but trust me, once you start filtering, you'll get a much clearly defined view. And so what I did is I filtered by my county and then by my city. And so by doing this, it gives you a clear defined of where your county is. The county is in that dark yellow orangish color, and then the city's in that red and also yellow color because it's still being mumbled with all the other layers. And like I said, we'll get to that layering in a second. So what we'll need to do after this is we'll need to start cutting out everything that's excess data. So what we'll do is we'll add some new vector layers where we'll take out all the roads, POIs, and unnecessary information that is not inside the county and inside the city. So that way it gets rid of all this information in white, or all this information that's outside the county boundary, and so we'll get a much more clearly defined image. And so as you can see, we did that with the highways, and so it looks a lot better. We're starting to get somewhere. And so next what we'll need to do is we'll need to get the POIs out and then start clearly defining up our city boundaries, and then get those and then label those POIs so we know where we need to take the kids from their schools to the outskirts of the city, because that was another assumption that I was made, is that they're not going to go outside the city to take these kids, because some of these parents might work in the city, and you don't want to take them outside the city, because then the parents are going to have to be driving even further to come get their kid and then plan for that disaster. They want to be able to pick up their kid now and go. So as I said, I used some new vector layers and overlaid the highways with the county boundaries to get that nice, clean, just inside the county highways and roads. And then next I'll probably do the same thing with the river that I chose and the POIs. So as you can see here, the city is now yellow, or not yellow, the city is now pink. And so that is the city boundaries of the city. And so we can see those POIs are in that yellowish green color. And so there's a big cluster in that top right that we're really concerned about, because the river, you'll see in a minute, once it starts flooding, those POIs are going to be kind of in danger in that flood zone. And we want to be able to move them out to the outskirts of the city boundaries so that way their parents can come pick them up. And so what we'll do next is we will enlarge that river by making it a bigger blue line, just to show what would it look like when it started flooding. And we'll label the POIs, of course, to start getting an indication of where everything is. So first, as I said, we increase the river size so we can see how those POIs are starting to be gathered in that cluster at the top right. Excuse me. And that river is now starting to expand, so we need to get those kids out of there fast because. And so what we'll do next is we'll, of course, then overlay that with vector layers and take all the roads outside of the county out, because we're only concerned about the roads in the city now, because now that we have all of our information shown to us. And so we see how that all those POIs are gathered and clustered in that top right where that river is starting to expand. And so you'll need to make a copy of your road data and put this copy right above your current road data, and then you'll need to filter it by finding the main road that is going to take you from your cluster to those outskirts at the bottom. So for me, I looked at the roads and then found the main road that was going to take me through that cluster and then to those outskirts cities. You can see how this main road cuts straight through the cluster and then branches off to go to those two different locations. Will show people that this is the quickest way to get to these locations. While there may be other roads for some schools to get to these locations, this is the main one that will be the most efficient to go to all the schools. See, if we're going there and back, you're not having to cut through everything and then be like, oh, like, did I take a right or left outside? I'm like, no, it's a straight shot from these schools. You just take one turn and you're going towards these schools. And then next we added some color to the POI so we can clearly see them a little bit better. This was important so they've been clearly standing out. And so we can see how through highlighting and layering we were able to get this information available to the city, to the town, or city depending on what you're using. And so like I said, if we were going to show a recap, here's where we started out in the beginning with this big cluster of data, and then we were able to do filtering and using new vector layers by overlaying layers. We can see that we now have a clearly defined picture of what you should do in case of this flooding disaster, because we now see what the flood looks like when it's expanding. We can see all the roads inside the city, and we can filter it down to and highlight which roads need to be taken in order to best get to those outskirt locations. And the reason why we filtered all this down into those overlay layers is because we didn't need all that extra information. If you had all that extra information inside the picture, then people would be so confused because they'd be seeing all this information. It'd be just an information overload on them. They just need to get that information. They need to get the information they need quickly and not have to stare at the map for another 10 minutes. And so by doing all this, it creates a clear picture. And the reason this DisasterPlan was created is so towns and cities can be like, hey, if you're looking to move here, we have plans in place in case of disaster. Because no one wants to move somewhere where they're like, oh, I think it's unsafe because they don't have a plan for if disaster strikes. This town, for example, can be like, hey, if the dam does break and the river floods, we have a safe way to get your kids out of school into a secure location so you can come pick them up before the flood gets bad. And so then it's a more enticing commodity for people moving because they're like, hey, they have plans, they know what they're doing. And so by using location analytics, we can see the best possible route and the surrounding areas that you need to take in order to plan for disasters. Because if we didn't and we just had to guess, then people might come up with maps that aren't even correct. And like I said, this is just an example. This is not to be used in case of a real disaster situation. For this town or for any town, this is just an example. And so I thank you guys for being with me here today and talking about potential disaster plans using QGIS and location analytics. I really enjoyed it. And just another quick recap. We went from our big data of all of Tennessee, filtered it down to our county and city, where we had it like this, and then we slowly started inputting more of our data by filtering only the POIs in the city and the roads, and then we were able to highlight which roads would best fit the roads needed to be taken in order to get from that cluster of schools down to the bottom two schools where they would be able to safely take their kids so parents could come pick them up and then deal with the flood accordingly. And thank you guys for today.